Alright, so we're going in 3, 2, 1. Alright, so this is the submission for Okami. This is the any percent category. My name is Pop Rocks.
My name is Auride. Love Auride on Twitch and Twitter.
And so basically, this is just the bread and butter. It's a new game, and you're going to beat the game as fast as possible. So starting off, it's the River of Heavens. The first thing we'll probably want to go over is the dash storing and dash restoring mechanics, as it starts off being most relevant, especially for the beginning of the game.
Yeah, so you'll see Pop is going to be skipping every cutscene by pressing the start button, which we actually have bound to a turbo key, which is legal. And then after each time, he's going to do a bit of weird movement where Ami looks to sort of leap from the ground and then instantly stick back to it. It's called a jump dash, or a jump tackle dash restore. And all that's doing is we're jumping out of the cutscene, we're jumping into the cutscene, and then we're jumping out of it. Whenever we jump, the game stores a value called we call it the dash meter, and that represents how much speed Ami has. There's two levels. There's green dash and then gold dash, and each of them is 30% faster than the previous, which is faster than walking. There we just got the first celestial brush technique, which is called rejuvenation. Lets us restore things that are missing or broken. We're only going to use it a couple times though. This general gimmick is going to be we can pause the game at any time and then draw on the screen to do various things, and we're going to be abusing that heavily later.
Yeah, definitely one of the most unique and defining mechanics of the game is that brush mechanic. The game has a lot of similarities that you might recognize from other Zelda games around this era in like the 2000s, where you're using, instead of items you collect to overcome obstacles, bosses, and dungeons, you're using mostly your brush techniques that you're going to be acquiring throughout the game. So we're here in the tutorial area. This is the River of Heavens. This is where the game is meant to be giving you your first couple techniques and your first couple engagements. Unfortunately for the game, we're not really interested in combat, so we won't be seeing any of those here, but we will be collecting the second technique here, which is Power Slash, one of the most useful techniques in the game, used frequently throughout the run.
Yes, it's just a very basic, you draw a line and it cuts through whatever you want it to cut through. For the most part, this is used in battles, but there's obviously a few obstacles we have to overcome using Power Slash, like with that gate there.
So there we run around the first fight trigger in the game. Not a very eventful trick. There's simply just a gap you can run around, and there's one more coming up you can simply avoid, just to skip some further tutorial and introductory combat, as we're making our way out of the River of Heavens and proceeding out into the more open world of the game.
The story of this game is pretty interesting. It's a very fun game casually, but the gist is the whole world is cursed. There's a fish in a lake in Hokkaido, because we're in Japan, and we have to go kill the fish, and we're trying to get to the fish as fast as possible. But that's basically the gist of it, and everything along the way is just an obstacle in our path. Any people we can avoid helping, we're going to avoid helping them. Any worlds we can avoid saving, we're going to avoid saving them, just to get to that fish. And to begin with, we're going to enter the beginning area of the game, which is Kamiki Village, which is currently afflicted by petrification, so all the villagers have been turned into stone. And like I suggested, we are not going to be helping them.
So this is one of the newer tricks in the run, discovered by a Legoer of Egos. This has been implemented within the last month or so. Previously, we would play the game more or less as intended here, which involves saving the village, unpetrifying the villagers. But what we found is a technique known as deboosting, and basically the way it works is when a dialog box closes, there's a one-frame window where you can tackle as if you were on the ground. By jumping out of the tackle, it allows you to basically restore your jump in midair, giving you just enough height to get over the boulder and out of the village without any further delay.
And this brings us to our first hub area of the game, Shinshu Field. You may notice we're actually playing in Japanese, which is common in a lot of speed games, and that's just because the text speed is faster. We can skip most dialogue in the game, but there's a few things where we can't really skip the dialogue, or we have to watch a bit of the dialogue, and just having a few less characters is worth the time save. We did, when we left Kamiki Village earlier without helping anyone, we did actually skip our first brush technique, which is called Sunrise. And this technique is unique in the fact that it's supposed to be an intrinsic part of Amaterasu, our main character's abilities. However, you might think, well, aren't you supposed to use Sunrise a bunch of different times in the game? This is true, however, as it turns out, the game never actually checks that you've acquired Sunrise, it only checks that you draw the right symbol, so we can still complete all of the checks. This brings us to our first actual fight that we cannot skip. These are imps. There's green imps and red imps. The red imps have a stringed instrument on their back that they can use to block attacks, but we can destroy it with Power Slash. We're following a specific pattern with this fight, designed to make sure that we have full ink when all of the enemies die, which allows us to gain a little bit of extra money from them. The currency in this game being called yen in English, or ryo in Japanese.
Yeah, the yen in this, especially the beginning of the game, is very tight. We're definitely trying to maximize our gains at the end of every combat, and we do actually need to pick up a couple treasures in this route as well. This is a result of many of the kind of game-breaking glitches we're using ends up skipping a lot of opportunities to get the yen that we need for items for combat and for techniques we're going to be purchasing later on. So as a result of all of the skips we're doing, we do have to be very conscientious about our yen to avoid not having enough money for the strategies we want to do later on.
You'll notice in combat we're using a combination of brush techniques and our basic attack with the item on our back, which is called a Divine Instrument. This particular Divine Instrument is called Divine Retribution, and you'll be seeing a lot of it because we actually never acquire any of the upgraded Divine Instruments, except for a couple which we don't bother equipping until very late in the game. So we're going to be relying much more heavily on battle items, which we'll be seeing later, and mostly the Celestial Brush. Here's the first time there's actually a required check for Sunrise, except that you can see we just draw a circle, and the game pretends we drew a sun. So you can see it starts glowing. And this is a very common trend throughout the game. The one downside to not having Sunrise is that we cannot actually turn the time of day to day, which is something that's never explicitly required, but you're sort of expected to be able to do. We will get an ability much later that lets us turn it to night, but sometimes we do actually want it to be day, so it is a little bit inconvenient that we don't have it, but not a big problem in this run. This is the introduction to a fan-favorite character, Susanoo, who is one of the people we forgot to save in Kamiki Village. He made it out on his own, legend that he is. And this introduces a sort of repeating trend in the game, which is the QTEs, where we help Susanoo cut through things if he's not strong enough to do it by himself. And here is our good friend Sleepy the Bear. We'll be seeing more of him later. But this also introduces one of our favorite parts of the game, which is ball-pushing mechanics.
Yeah, ball pushing, definitely one of the more frustrating parts of the game. The balls, they roll, they slide, they stick to you a little bit, but not too much. It's definitely very frustrating and requires a gentle touch of a master speedrunner to really control it in any meaningful way.
You'd not believe how much practice Pop has put into pushing those balls. They're quite painful. Especially, like, anyone who's played this game even casually will know how annoying the ball physics are. This introduces our third brush technique, Bloom, which lets us restore vegetation, among other things. In this case, it's very important that we get this because this lets us restore the guardian saplings. Basically, the fish in Hokkaido is causing the whole of Japan to be cursed, and the only way to dispel the curse is to bloom these saplings. Here we're doing a more complicated fight skip. This one's actually kind of precise. It just skips a repeat of one of the fights we did earlier.
And especially in the early game, we really want to avoid these fight triggers because we don't really have the combat tools to quickly beat these enemies yet. One of our next major goals we're going to be getting in the next couple of minutes will help us out with that and really speed up combat going forward, but for right now, we are very, very challenged by some of the enemies here.
Yeah, one of the enemies we fought earlier, a yellow imp, it's actually a bit of RNG to fight it before we have this next brush technique that Pop is describing. So this brings us back to Shinshu Field. You can see now more clearly it's afflicted by a curse, which I call the Black Caviar. What you see to our left is actually a Demon Scroll. Those are optional fights, and we can always avoid them. We can just run around them. Sometimes they'll chase you, especially if it's at nighttime. And we try to avoid that. Sometimes it's harder than others, but usually it's not too bad. So now that Shinshu is healed, we're going to head off to get our next brush technique. However, for reasons that are sort of strange, we can't get that technique until it's nighttime. And we don't want to wait around the roughly 5.5 minutes it would take for it to turn night naturally. So instead we're going to abuse a side quest, which isn't actually required either, which is called the Wanted List. And there's a few of these in the game, but it turns out for the tutorial of this first Wanted List, it'll turn it to night for you, since it needs to be night for you to fight the Wanted List enemies, which are basically just stronger versions of regular enemies. So here you can see it'll turn night automatically.
So here we've got the Wanted List fight. One thing that's really kind of unique about these fights is once you beat the wanted enemy, the rest of the imps will just die on their own. So we just have to go straight for him, and then the fight is over. And then you get to engage with a little bit of a frustrating mechanic where you have to cross the name off the list with your brush. The game does like to include little flavorful moments like these where you kind of use your brush in kind of a literal way at times, and definitely have to be careful with the brush registration on these.
The name of the enemy, of the wanted enemy, is actually random, and you'll notice that it's in Japanese, and we have to cross out the right name on the list. So you do have to actually at least learn to pattern recognize the shape of the name in order to cross out the right one without wasting much of time. One thing we haven't really discussed much is our flavorful companion, the one on our back, which is Isun, the pint-sized swordsman. He's the one who talks for us, since Ami herself is a dog that can't talk. And we don't like him because talking is slow.
Isun's got a lot to say at all the worst times.
Here you can actually see a mechanic which happens when Ami runs out of ink. Each time you use a brush technique, it uses one ink pot, and we have 3 of them to start with. And running out of ink turns Ami into sort of a mortal form where she can't dash, she can't use her divine instrument, and she can't use the brush most of all. And so we try to avoid that as much as possible. This gives us one of the best brush techniques in the entire game, much underappreciated by casuals, which is Cherry Bomb. This lets us create explosives, which, as you can imagine, is quite helpful. Great that we get it so early.
The Cherry Bomb, definitely one of the most powerful combat techniques. We're going to be seeing it throughout the run in a variety of enemies where using the Cherry Bomb can greatly speed up combat, even in situations where you don't have a lot of yen to purchase items that would speed it up, or you don't have any item, or not item, but rather equipment upgrades, like more powerful weapons, divine instruments, and such. The Cherry Bomb can really act as a Swiss Army knife in a way to allow you to overcome a lot of these combat situations without actually having the tools that you would normally have through like a casual playthrough.
Here we're going to be doing the first major skip of the run, or well, the second to be honest. Now it is. This is Agata early, sometimes called water lily skip or lily pad skip. Basically, normally you're supposed to get another brush technique by returning to Kamiki there, which lets you make platforms on the water by drawing a circle, and the platforms are just water lilies. But we can skip that by doing a glitch called a cornered glitch jump. Basically, wherever 2 corners meet, if Ami's in the water and she swims slowly into it, you can usually get a magical jump out of the water, and that lets us get a wall jump, which lets us get onto the platform. And that brings us all the way to the Guardian Sapling of Agata.
Yeah, so Agata Forest, this is kind of the first kind of area of the game where the training wheels really come off and you start to get a little bit more freedom. And we're going to start using that freedom to really break the game's expectations. So the first thing we're doing here, this is a trick known as Waka Skip. This is a brush adventure, I suppose the first brush adventure of the game. So brush adventures conceptually are kind of unlocking your brush and using it to do things like go out of bounds, go far away from Ami, and allow you to interact with things with your brush very far away. So in this instance, what we're going to do is clip our brush through the floor and out of bounds, and then drag it all the way to a cursed patch across the map. And by blooming this cursed patch, this cutscene will teleport Ami to the patch, which puts us right next to the mermaid spring that we want to activate to teleport back to later on. And furthermore, will allow us to skip a mandatory fight trigger that was waiting for us right outside of the cave we were in.
Yeah, so there's a whole lot going on right now. This is actually a really complicated segment, but the gist is right now we're going to be getting a feed bag, which is an item that lets us feed animals. And then we're going to then do a pretty complicated setup with this cabbage here. So this is our second ball pushing puzzle. One of the final ones in the game, fortunately. And we're going to be seeing the return of Sleepy the bear. So Sleepy loves balls, and he wants to stand on all kinds of balls, and this cabbage is very ball-shaped. So we're going to be pushing the cabbage to Sleepy. However, we don't just want to give it to him. We want something in return. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be pushing the cabbage into this torch. We're going to cut the torch. The torch will respawn roughly 10 seconds later, and we want to very precisely, very, very carefully position the cabbage so that when the torch respawns, it pushes the cabbage into Sleepy's trigger. However, we also want to then do a setup where we do another brush adventure. We're going to clip the camera through the ground here, and we're going to drag the brush all the way to yet another cursed patch, which are these like purplish patches of evil energy in the ground. And then we're going to use this dialogue from examining a bench to stall the game from loading the cutscene of returning or of giving the cabbage to Sleepy. And then after that dialogue, we're going to be holding the brush button, and this makes it so that we can trigger another cutscene on the same frame as the Sleepy cutscene, which is the cutscene of restoring the curse pack. And this lets us gain a state known as cutscene storage, which is related to another glitch called walking while talking, which you might know from some other games. In this case, the important thing is that now the game is waiting to play a cutscene, and we're actually going to pick up some items here on the way, just because we'll need them later. The game is waiting to play the next part of the Sleepy cutscene, but it can't do it because we've interrupted the cutscene script. However, because the game is waiting to play a cutscene, it won't play certain other cutscenes. And one of those, very fortunately, is the cutscene of Ami getting swept away by the rapids in this river here. And this river is normally what blocks you off from getting to the next major area of the game. So normally if we landed in this river, we just get swept away and lose some health. But because we have cutscene storage, we can just swim through the river and reach Taka Pass much earlier than expected. And this skips actually the first major dungeon of the game, which is Tsuda Ruins. So all that said, we're going to be returning much later to complete Tsuda Ruins since we can't actually skip it. But this is a pretty major skip overall.
One of the kind of key considerations of the route is there's a lot of aspects of the game that are a lot quicker once you have certain technique accessible later on. So we're really just trying to set everything up a little bit for later. Once we have a little bit more yen and a little bit more powers available to us, we'll be able to come back to places like Tsuda Ruins and to the area here as well once we're a little bit more prepared. So, beginning of the game, you're definitely looking to kind of progress the story, or at least progress yourself physically through the game world a little bit more of an accelerated pace. That way, we can set everything up for later to be as efficient as possible.
During this fight, this is the introduction of our fan-favorite character, Waka, who we're not going to be seeing too much, since we obviously want to see as few people as possible. At the start of the fight, we did something where we upgraded our ink capacity, so now we have 4 ink pots instead of 3. and that also had the bonus of refilling our ink, which is helpful to avoid running out of ink at the end of this fight. In order to upgrade things like ink and our purse size, which we'll be doing later on, we need praise, and praise is just gotten from various main quest and side questy things. Just any time we like heal the world or help people in any way, we get praise. Obviously, we're avoiding that as much as possible, so we don't get as much praise as we might like. But we do get enough to do things like upgrade our ink here and there. And also, at the start of that fight, we used our first battle item, which is the Steel Fist Sake. It's this orange pot of sake that we get. The important thing about it is that it doubles the power of our Cherry Bomb, which is very handy versus things that are vulnerable to explosives, which a lot of enemies are. And here we're healing Taka Pass, so now we can progress even further.
So Taka Pass is one of the areas where we actually do a couple like side quest type things. Most areas in the game we're really sprinting through, and definitely no nonsense progression through the game. There are a couple things in Taka Pass that are pretty important to us. So the first thing is we're going to be doing this little fetch quest mini game in which we have to defeat the unfortunately named Molsters in order to claim the golden teapot from them. This is something we're going to hold on to for a little bit, and it will help us get a secret brush technique later on. And then furthermore, after that, we're going to be heading over to a demon gate. So demon gates are kind of stationary encounters placed throughout the overworld that have certain... they restore the map a little bit when you complete them, and that will allow us to unlock our second mermaid pool, which will come into play later, why it's so important that we get that one.
Yeah, the Mermaid Springs are basically fast travel locations. Although we don't have currently the ability to use them, we can unlock them early and let us warp back to areas later, which is naturally very helpful since there are a few backtracking points in this game. What Pop mentioned earlier with secret brush techniques, there are some brush techniques in this game that aren't required. There are technically 15 required ones, although they're made in 13 groups. 3 of them are grouped together. But we're going to be skipping a bunch of those. One of the ones that we want to skip, actually, we do need to use it. However, we can, instead of getting that brush technique, we can get one of its secret versions, which we can actually do without getting the original. And that'll serve as our alternative much later on when we need it.
Here we can kind of see the strength of Cherry Bomb in combat, so we're kind of getting to use it for the first time here. And I use it on both of those enemies. It just does a lot of damage and tends to put lower level creatures into hit stun. And it's definitely, to put it lightly, the crutch of combat, especially for like the early to mid game.
This next area that we're visiting is Sasa Sanctuary. It's actually locked off. Basically, it's a bathhouse run by birds, and it's run not only by birds but a bird mafia. And the daughter of the head of the mafia was kidnapped, and unfortunately, we would have to rescue her in order to gain entry. That's too slow, so we're going to take the back entrance, or really the top entrance. We're going to be doing a pretty precise technique here called a seam grip, where we can sort of stick to the ground even where 2 slopes meet, even though we're not supposed to be able to land on those slopes. And this lets us get out of bounds. In Okami, the interiors of areas are actually stored underneath the map, often in strange locations. And in this case, we can actually gain entry to the interior of Sasa Sanctuary by jumping in from above, which is what you're seeing now. And this lets us get to the area behind Sasa Sanctuary, which is our actual destination. Now, unfortunately, we're actually now trapped inside Sasa Sanctuary, but we'll see what we're going to do about that much later.
So the main reason we have to come into here so early is this particular brush technique. We're going to have to dig up from underground. So first we've got a little digging minigame. This is meant to be a recurring minigame type throughout the run, but fortunately for us, this is the only one that we're not able to skip. So it's fairly whimsical concept. You kind of have to dig your way down using your brush techniques and canine abilities in order to help a human companion to reach the bottom. And upon doing so, he will dig up a celestial god for you, and this will begin to get us the water spout technique. Water spout is one of the useful techniques in the game that is going to be required. In fact, within the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to need it. So we just stop by here at our earliest opportunity so that we can have it for when we need it.
So here you can see the tutorial for water spout. Getting through those digging minigames quickly is actually kind of difficult. It's a pretty precise sequence, so great job.
So this is one of the interesting kind of effects of Sasa Sanctuary early. So you're not intended to come to this area until a little bit later in the game when you've started a quest to retrieve the power orbs from all of the canine warriors. So this is a quest that starts in a place we've never been, Kusa Village. However, when we do Sasa Sanctuary early, the game simply assumes that we're meant to be here and that we're meant to be on this quest, and it will give us the canine tracker, which we don't have, and it will allow us to fight a dog that we really have no reason to fight yet in the story. And there are going to be some rippling effects of this later on. We'll see. Not only is this in and of itself a little bit strange, but there's going to be even more unusual effects afterwards.
Yeah, so this is our first of 4 dog fights. The dogs are sort of some of the most annoying enemies to fight since they're very random, and their fight patterns have a lot of influence on how you're supposed to do the fight. But the general gist is that we draw a bunch of cherry bombs and push them into it. This first dog here is Take, our good friend, one of the most jumpy dogs. So, here he's doing a super armor attack, which causes a lot of damage. So we have to hope for the best with their patterns sometimes. In this case, it wasn't a great pattern, but it was handled pretty well, I'd say. You might notice at the end of each fight, we get a grading screen. We can actually clear those grade screens a bit faster by barking, so that's why you'll see Pop barking a lot at the end of each fight. It's not just for fun. We do actually have a dedicated bark button, which is excellent. One of the most wonderful things about this game.
So here we're going to solve the problem of the fact that we fell into this area from out of bounds, and there's still a massive gate that the boss will not let us through because we never saved his daughter, as she will now be eaten by the Crow Tengu. However, fortunately for us, when we leave that back area, the little garden, after defeating Take, Mr. Bamboo will give us a mermaid coin, which is kind of the tutorial to those pools to warp us around. So it's a little bit serendipitous that, in fact, once we clip into somewhere that we can't escape, the game gives us the very item we need in order to escape. And then we're able to warp out back to Taka Pass using the mermaid spring that we unlocked by doing the demon gate earlier. And now we're able to progress to the next story area, or is it the previous story area, Kusa Village?
Yes, so Kusa Village is actually afflicted by a strange sort of curse. There's no guardian sapling here, but the atmosphere constantly drains our ink. So the only really important thing here is that we get to the end before we run out of ink. So we're just going to do a little bit of parkour, avoid talking to any of these people who are, having a bit of trouble because their whole town is cursed. Our objective here is a person named Princess Fusei, basically the shrine maiden of the village, and she's sort of the origin of this curse.
So one of the interesting parts of this fight is because Kusa Village is cursed, this curse carries over to this combat encounter, and in fact you can't use your brush techniques, similar to how you couldn't use them in Kusa Village itself. You're also restricted from using them in this fight, which is very inconvenient for us, as we've now skipped multiple opportunities to upgrade our weapons, and we're very short on yen, we are able to use an excess that we picked up back in Agata Forest, and then simply use 8 attacks with our Divine Instrument to finish off the enemy without having access to any of our powerful Power Slash or Cherry Bomb techniques.
Yeah, so by talking to Fusei, she's actually the owner of the Canine Warriors, so she gives us the canine tracker properly, which we actually got earlier. And now we have to go around the village feeding all of the dogs, all of the Canine Warriors that are not being very nice and disobeying her orders to return. So that's why we bought those meat feed bags earlier.
Yeah, it's unfortunately not enough just to find the warriors. You have to feed them as well. Every canine warrior requires you to either feed them or fight them. So we had one of the fights earlier, and now it's time for chow time.
Right, so after feeding this dog, we're actually going to do a bit of a strange brush adventure, and this is once again to warp past a cutscene trigger, which is something we did similar to in Agata Village. This particular application is called Shin Warp, because the dog that we're revealing by doing this is named Shin.
Yeah, it's a very unique brush adventure where we're going to be warping ourselves all the way up back to near the entrance of Kusa Village. And one thing that's kind of interesting about this trick is that it's been known about for a while, but hasn't been used in runs until the last 6 months or so. Due to the effects of Sasa Sanctuary, we no longer have to wait until nighttime in order to progress the storyline, which means using brush adventures like that once again became viable and kind of adds a little bit of extra tech to this area.
One interesting thing that just happened, there's actually 4 dogs in Kusa Village that we have to feed, but we've only fed 3 of them. But the game thinks we've already encountered 4 dogs because we already fought one of them in Sasa Sanctuary. So the game is actually going to give us basically a freebie. However, we still need to feed the 4th dog, and we're actually going to take advantage of which dog we did not feed in a bit here after this fight. So this is actually the first Canine Warrior we're supposed to fight, so he's a little bit weaker than the other ones. He only takes 2 bombs.
Tay is a good dog. He's got less health than the other Canine Warriors, and typically also tends to have patterns with a lot less jumping around and invulnerability attacks, and tends to stay still. So here we're going to be abusing the fact that we've one more dog yet to feed, and basically once you defeat Tay, all the dogs will kind of gather around in a circle in a triumph of uniting the Canine Warriors or so. But because the dog that we haven't fed yet comes over to where we are able to feed that dog very easily. However, the game still has the cutscene trigger that when you feed him, the cutscene will warp you to where the dog was supposed to be originally. So there's 2 effects of this. The first thing is that by doing the half blue skip brush adventure in Agata Forest, first of all, we were able to skip getting the vine technique from the Sutta Ruins, and that dog is meant to be accessed by using vine. So first of all, it allows us to skip a brush technique that we don't have, and it would be very challenging to get to him, in fact probably impossible without having vine. And second of all, it also warps us nearer to the entrance of Kusa Village. So this effect of doing Sasa early, allowing us to warp the dog to us, and then kind of switch places and warp us to where the dog was supposed to be, has a very beneficial effect on kind of the routing for that area of the game.
Okay, so here we're going to be entering another area, City Checkpoint. This is actually sort of like a preview of the game. The game is previewing the sort of next chapter of the story. Basically, at the start of the game, the big bad isn't really the fish in Hokkaido. We don't find out about that until later. It's this big snake thing called Orochi. And so once you defeat Orochi, you're then supposed to progress to the rest of the world. But the game teases the rest of the world a bit early by letting you access this area. But that was a very bad move by the developers. So the area is a huge gorge with a river across it, and there's a big bridge that you're supposed to lower with an ability that you get much later. However, the devs didn't really think too hard about this, so we can swim across the river by mashing jump. then we can do a bunch of very, very precise platforming on this rock here, and manage to get up onto the other side. And I can't even describe to you how hard that trick is. It takes hours and hours to practice, but Pop managed to get it first try.
So now it's about 35 minutes into the run, and we've made our way to roughly the second half of the game. And this is going to really allow us to pick and choose our battles going forward, where now we're going to be getting access to some more late-game techniques and some more areas to our disposal to really optimize our movement and do the game kind of in our own way. So here we're going to be doing a brush adventure. This is the Ryoshima brush adventure to bloom the sapling, basically. So the way that this works is there are a series of pools. You're meant to use the water spout technique in order to fill the pools in sequence until you can get the water all the way to the top, which will restore the guardian sapling and allow it to bloom it. However, that takes about 20 or so seconds to do, and instead there's a brush adventure you can do where you clip your camera through the floor and can water spout directly to the top pool, and the cutscene triggered by doing so will actually warp you up to the sapling. So not only can you skip filling multiple pools in sequence and needing to climb up the mountain, you'll get skipped all the way to the top of the mountain, and you can use water spout only one time and make it all the way to the top.
There's a lot of very convenient spots like that. Here we're actually going to be doing one of the very few times we actually just clip through geometry. There's a tiny hole in the level geometry here which lets us get under the stairs, and we're going to do once again something very similar to what we did in Sasa, where we clip into an interior. And this is the interior of the dojo. Now you might know, if you played this game, the dojo is actually way off in the like sea, off the coast. But it turns out that the interiors of areas are often not stored anywhere near their exteriors. So this one happens to be in a convenient location that we can reach from the stairs. So here we're getting to the dojo early because we want to get one specific technique from the dojo, which is very important, and that's a double jump. And as you can imagine, if you've been watching the tricks so far, it's a lot of platforming in a lot of cases, whenever it's not the brush, basically. Having a double jump is insanely helpful. So it's very important that we get this early on, since it enables a bunch of skips in other parts of the game.
Yeah, and after getting double jump, we're going to be immediately putting it to use. So there's a mandatory fight trigger on the bridge up ahead. It's a fight with the Ubume, and we really don't want to have any unnecessary time spent in combat, and we're going to be able to use double jump to skip that fight. So there's a very small gap that you can access by double jumping in a very precise way that will allow you to slip right past the trigger without activating it. And like so, we're able to avoid that fight and move on with going to Seian City.
Yeah, so Seian City is the capital of Japan in this case, and it's afflicted by a horrible plague. Everyone's dying, which, you know, very topical. And we're, again, not going to help any of them because we're entirely going to skip the part where we dispel the plague. And we're going straight to the boss, which is Queen Himiko. But we're going to take a bit of a detour to do something that was mentioned pretty early on. If you remember, we got the golden teacup from the Molsters. We traded that for a golden mushroom, and now we're going to be doing yet another, what is called an interior clip, to get into a building which is currently afflicted by a curse, so that we can't enter it from the outside. But as it turns out, the building's interior still exists underneath the map. So just by getting out of bounds here, by doing some very precise platforming, we can clip into it. You've seen this whole rigmarole before. We have to fall for about 15 seconds to get to where the interiors are stored. And this one happens to be stored underneath these shears on the map. So you can sort of use the overlay map as a visual marker for guiding how far we need to move in the air in order to reach where we want to go. So here we give the golden mushroom to a good friend, the cat chef. He's going to do some chef kung fu. And then we draw an infinity symbol, and that will give us our next brush technique. So this is Fire Burst. This lets us make fire whenever we want. And it skips an ability called Inferno, which is basically the fire version of Water Spout, which lets us take fire from a fire source and bring it to other places. So you'd imagine this is a bit more powerful, but it has some major downsides and some major upsides. We actually get a bunch of free money from doing this as well. For some reason, that the rice explosion that he cooked up there gives us 26,000 yen, which is extremely helpful. So you can see there, we popped out of that building inside a cursed zone. And I actually misspoke earlier. This is actually a pretty new development. Earlier I said we're going to Queen Himiko. We're not doing that. So the main reason we would go to Queen Himiko, which we can do at this point, surprisingly, and you'll see why later, but the main reason we'd go there is to gain entry to North Ryoshima Coast, because she can give us a passport, basically. North Ryoshima Coast is guarded by this massive gate, which is topped with a massive invisible wall. And before it was thought, well, there's no way we could possibly jump over it, right? But as it turns out, we can actually weave in and out of some geometry here in order to get over it. And so the reason why this trick took so long to discover is because the mountains that we're jumping on top of here are actually covered in... they're topped with a type of geometry with a special property called jump barrier, which basically means we can't jump while we're above the rocks. But what we can do is we can do what's called a sliding ground tackle, where we initiate a ground tackle on slopes geometry, and that lets us get off of the jump barrier in time to do a ground jump out of our sliding ground tackle. And it's an incredibly difficult trick. Managed to get it second try, so once again, applause for Pop.
Yeah, it's one of the brand new additions to this run within the last 2 weeks or so, and definitely one that's almost hard to describe how difficult it is in order to access North Ryoshima even earlier than before. So now going to the northern Ryoshima coast, as we've now kind of bypassed another major segment of the game, we have a couple mandatory cutscenes, a mandatory fight, and now we're going to be heading off to the Catcall Tower to get another brush technique that we're going to be needing.
I'm going to do a bit of shopping beforehand. We've only done one shopping trip up to now, and we're sort of running low on resources. So now that we have a bit more money, from Fireburst, we're going to spend that on some things. We're going to buy some mermaid coins, a fish feed bag, and a few other battle items that we'll be using later. The mermaid coins are obviously very useful for doing fast travel. It's actually all the mermaid coins we'll be using for the rest of the run. It used to be a lot more, but with all the skips, we can skip many of them. We're going to do a quick detour to unlock that mermaid pool. You have to actually get close to them in order for them to activate. And then we're going to head over to this guy. This is Urashima. And the only thing we're doing is we're going to ignore him. Because he basically tells us how to do the next thing. So here we draw another sun, a fake sun, to summon the envoy of the Dragonians, named Orca, basically a big dolphin. And all this means is we can use him to help us swim through the sea, since we can't swim very far without drowning. So, this is one of the first really major downtimes in the whole run. Up till now, it's been all action all the time. At this point, we're just swimming over to this island here. And then within the island, it'll be a bit more downtime.
Catcall Tower is one of the brush techniques being investigated for potentially being skipped next. But in the meantime, there are a couple uses of catwalk that are very difficult to skip. So we will be climbing the tower and using our fish to feed the cat at the top. Unfortunately for us, it's a very tall tower, and the only way to get up is rhythmic mashing. So we're going to be using a little bit of a precise series of inputs here. We're going to be jumping away from the wall and double jumping up the wall. And we're going to be doing this for over a minute of continuous kind of button mashing in a very precise rhythmic pattern that definitely wears you out as you're on your way up.
Yeah, I've counted it out. It's actually about 200 jump inputs to do this properly. If you've done this casually, you can imagine how slow it is, but it must look really impressive, just how efficiently Pop is able to do the rhythm to get up the tower as fast as possible. There's these marks on the wall. Those are what let us stick to the wall and jump back off of it. These are called Kabegami marks, Kabegami being the god of walls. So we're just trying to get up as efficiently as possible. We're actually going to intentionally land on a platform here. The reason for that is because it causes Isun to give a dialogue, which normally we wouldn't want. However, if we went to the top of the tower without triggering any of Isun's dialogues in this area, the game would actually give us an extra cutscene where it gives us a reward for climbing the tower in one go, which you're supposed to get on your second trip here, but we can actually get it on our first. However, that cutscene for showing that you got the treasure is longer than Isun's dialogue, so we just listen to Isun for a bit to avoid seeing the treasure. Here we're going to do some fun jumps up this very confusing spiral staircase. The game has a bunch of areas where it takes away your manual control of the camera, and this has some knock-on effects for the movement, because every time the game switches the camera, it also tries to take away your dash, and it freezes your facing angle, which is very annoying. So we try to avoid that as much as possible by minimizing our movement. So here we feed this cat, and that causes the celestial brush gods to smile upon us and give us another brush technique.
Yeah, so this is going to be the catwalk technique, and basically, whenever a cat statue appears out in the world, you can use it to draw marks on the wall, similar to the ones we just climbed up, and it will allow you to circumstantially be able to climb up walls. So maybe not one of the most exciting techniques, but there are a lot of areas, particularly in dungeons, where they like you to be able to use them to overcome certain obstacles, and we will be needing it later on. So now that we've kind of rushed our way through, I don't know, 80% of the game, we're going to be backtracking a bit. Now that we have everything we need, like the double jump and fire burst, and a lot more yen, now we're going to start going back to clean up some of our loose ends. And the first two loose ends we're going to be working on are the Dog Quest and Tsuta Ruins.
First we have to take a bit of a detour. This is actually part of the main quest. We have to help this character here, Kushi, fill up her sake barrel with pure spring water. This would be relevant later in the story, but we're actually skipping the part that it's for, so it's sort of a vestige that we just can't skip because of the way the devs decided to sequence things out. There's just no way to get around it. So here's another one of those Susanoo QTEs where he's very confused by the fact that his sword is sharper than it should be, one-shotting all these enemies that even we couldn't one-shot normally.
I believe that is going to be the last time we see a Susanoo QTE in the run. There are intended to be several other times where this happened, especially in relating to previously mentioned Orochi. Unfortunately for Susanoo, his time in the spotlight is over, and he's not part of our quest to save Nippon anymore.
Here we have Kokari, a boy who's trying to fish with no fishing line, and fortunately we can use Rejuvenation to help him with that. So we can fill in his fishing line and do a fishing minigame. There would normally be a bunch of these, but this is another one of those cases where there's one remaining minigame that we can't skip, so we still have to do it. The fish here that we get are random, and they actually we actually sell the fish later, and they have different yen values. Fortunately, there's enough leniency in the yen route at this point that we don't need to worry about which fish we get, but it is kind of funny to, sort of worry about whether you're getting good fishing luck or not. The way the fish move is also RNG. Sometimes they can swim right towards you and save you time, but it doesn't make much of a difference.
So one of the interesting effects of this is basically what's happening right now. As a result of the fact that we skipped the first fishing with the Kokari boy, and then came back at a later point in the story when there was intended to be a second fishing event, the first and second one kind of get combined. So when we first ran into him, we triggered a cutscene as if it were the second time fishing with him. However, when we entered fishing, it was the first fishing sequence, but then again, exiting after fishing, it's kind of merging the two together. So here we're getting the crescent power, which is meant to be obtained after the second fishing sequence, and we're also going to be fighting his dog Ume as part of the dog quest after what is intended to be your second time fishing with him. But simultaneously, during this fight, you're also going to see we have a teardrop-shaped key in our mouth, which is intended to be obtained after the first fishing event. So the game's really confused what's going on right now, to say the least, and it's kind of merging these two cutscenes and these two mini games into one in a way.
It's very lucky that things work out this way. If the game didn't give us this key after this fishing, we'd actually be entirely screwed. We wouldn't be able to enter the dungeon. So it's very convenient that it does that. But unfortunately, we do still have to fight this dog. It'd be nice if we could skip that. This technique that we got, Crescent, this is the inverse of Sunrise, the technique I described earlier that lets us turn it to night, which is actually going to be used in a couple times later on. But there's no like hard checks for it, at least not that we can't skip. Now that we have this key, we're going to dash over to the ruins and open it up.
Yeah, so this is the first dungeon in the game, both in terms of what the game intends you to do and in what we actually do. However, it's simply much later than what the game thought was going to happen. So we do have, as I said before, double jump and fire burst, both of which are never intended to be used during your progress through this dungeon, and will allow us to do a really different experience than what a casual player can do. So our first order of business, we're doing the intro cutscene skip like so. We're going to be jumping over a cutscene trigger that lasts about 18 seconds, if you were to watch the cutscene. And using a very precise wall jump and tackle, you can kind of avoid this mandatory cutscene, mandatory unskippable cutscene at that, and move your way on to a little bit deeper in the dungeon without any delay.
Yeah, most of the cutscenes in this game we can skip, but there's a few times where, for various reasons, we just can't, and so we try to skip those cutscenes in other ways. Here we're going to be doing a technique called first skip, where we skip single skip, where we skip a fight against a single Bud Ogre enemy. And this one is actually quite precise. We have to wall bounce very parallel to a wall, which the game doesn't like to let you do, in order to get up to this ledge here, which is just barely possible even with double jump. And then we jump over the trigger.
Yeah, and then coming up here, there's another trick that I'm struggling a little bit to set up. So after the single Bud Ogre skip, you then have a double Bud Ogre skip in the next room coming up. We're going to need Gold Dash in order to do this, and you are meant to jump and double jump and tackle very precisely to avoid the fight trigger, which unfortunately does not happen in this run. However, we do get a little bit of a saving grace here is using the Fire Burst technique. We're able to instantly open up the Bud Ogres without needing to use your techniques to open them up using the brush, which does save a little bit of time as the game. We do have some late game techniques that allow us to save a little time with that error.
Yeah. The Bud Ogres are meant to be weak to fire, and there's no way you're supposed to have fire this early in the game, but it lets you get it anyway.
And then we're going to be doing a little bit of parkour using a log in order to wall jump and bounce our way up to the top there without having to grow any mushrooms. And there's a further little bit of platforming here in which you're going to be jumping around a little cutscene trigger. It only saves a couple seconds, but there is intended to be a sequence where Isun sneezes and collapses this bridge, and there's meant to be an exciting race across the bridge to make it before it crumbles. And we were able to skip that sequence with using double jump and some precise jumps here.
This brings us to Blockhead, our favorite wall. It would be nice if there was any way to clip around him, but we cannot. Basically just random spots on him, 2 dots appear, and we just have to draw dots on the dots. And that causes him to explode, which is wonderful.
So now we're coming up to one of the unique after effects of skipping sunrise. So as we discussed, there are a lot of instances in which we draw the sun, but the game does not actually require us to have sunrise. However, there's an instance here in which we don't actually draw the sun, but the game does require us to have sunrise for some reason. So there's a bridge here that we're meant to use the rejuvenation power in order to restore. And without the sunrise technique, it actually won't let us restore this bridge. So instead we have to do a very precise jump discovered by Auride called the Kamiki Killer. And it's something that you can only do with double jump, meaning that in order to do this trick we did have to delay Sutta Ruins as long as we did. And it is a little bit precise and loses you about 40 to 45 seconds when you mess it up. And unfortunately, that's what I did. So we're going to make another loop around past where Blockhead was and give it another try here.
Yeah, this is sort of a weird case where it seems like either the devs made a mistake in coding how the game checks for your brush abilities, or it might be like an intentional anti-cheat feature. We're really not sure. But unfortunately, it does mean we have to do this precise platforming to get around this bridge, since there's some big invisible walls that block us from just jumping right over it.
So here we've got a little series of demon gates. So as I mentioned earlier, demon gates are like these preset encounters, and in this case they're actually required in order to progress through the dungeon. So each demon gate is going to have different enemies in it. The first one is going to be a couple red imps and a butt ogre. And just like in the double butt ogre fight, we're going to be using Fire Burst to quickly dispatch of the butt ogre as well as the imps. And now we're going to be setting up for an interesting trick here. So this is going to be a brush adventure. This trick is called Pots Early, and this is a trick that requires us to have a Fire Burst. So later, after the demon gates are destroyed, pots will be spawning at the top of that waterfall. However, using Fire Burst, we're able to break them before they appear. And this is going to have some very complicated effects coming up.
Yeah, so like the pots are basically invisible, but some aspects of them still exist. They're immune to Power Slash, so we can't just try to cut through them, but they aren't immune to Cherry Bomb or Fire Burst. So by drawing a precisely placed Fire Burst, we can destroy all 5 of them at once. And this lets us trick the game, or cause the game to get fairly conflicted in terms of what cutscenes it wants to process. And that's going to allow us to actually skip some cutscenes that are otherwise unskippable after this fight.
That's right. So we're going to be drawing a sunrise here, which is going to trigger mushrooms to grow, but simultaneously the pots to spawn and be destroyed at the same time. And essentially, this is causing a similar effect to what happened back in Agata Forest with the cabbage and the bear, where we're triggering multiple cutscenes at the same time, and it allows us to kind of have partial control and skip the cutscene that would normally be unskippable. And even right now, as we're continuing through the run, we're kind of in a partial cutscene state. So we do have to be a little bit careful, as there is some risk of crashing and other unintended effects going on as a result of what we did there.
Yeah, at this point we have cutscene storage, and if we did the wrong things, like if we went through another cutscene before this, we could actually get ourselves soft locked. But fortunately, it is pretty easy to avoid that. So there's not really a material risk of that happening in a run.
So one of the kind of interesting parts of doing Sutta Ruins so late, as enabled by Half Blue Skip done earlier, is we don't actually have to beat the boss of this dungeon. Beating the Spider Queen is really only needed so that you can cross the river. Unfortunately for the game dev, we already did that about 40-50 minutes ago. We don't need to defeat Spider Queen in order to progress with the game, as we are now long past any state where that was a concern. So once we get the Vine technique, which we will be needing later on, we can simply walk out of the dungeon very uneventfully, and the only barrier left is the cutscene that we skipped on the way in, needs to be skipped once again on the way out, and then we can simply leave without completing the remainder of the dungeon.
Yes, this sort of concept of getting the item and skipping the boss is not unfamiliar to Zelda games. You can see this happen in like Twilight Princess as well. It's very convenient that we can do it here to skip a boss that's kind of slow to fight. There is a cool trick to get to that boss earlier, but unfortunately we don't get to see that. But it's much better to be fast than cool. And this is pretty cool anyway.
So now we're going to be wrapping up the dog quest, as you may call it, finding the last canine warrior, who's actually in the first area of the game, Kamiki Village, which you might not remember very well because we ran straight through it while they were petrified and completely cursed by simply doing boulder skip at the beginning of the run. Fortunately for them, not only did Susano seemingly make it out, but the rest of the village is doing better now too. And by doing the dog quest, Kamiki Village will kind of restore itself eventually. And we're able to proceed with finding the last canine warrior here.
So here we're actually going to do a bit of a minigame yet again. We have to dig up all 10 of these turnips while avoiding Mushi's mom. If she slaps us, we lose, so you have to power slash the bucket on her head to stun her so that she doesn't slap us. And this is actually surprisingly difficult. You can lose a lot of time here because you have to mash for the digging and try to minimize the number of times you slash her because each time is, you know, a couple seconds left. But here we get the oddly shaped turnip, or as I like to call it, Mushi's dad. And we bring it to this kid here who's Mushi. And the reason we do that is because that's what allows us to fight the final canine warrior here, Hayabusa. And in addition to that, it has to be night. So we actually have to use Crescent here, wait for it to turn night, and then we can fight him. Conversely, it actually has to be day in order for us to dig up the turnips. So it's very convenient that the game automatically sets it to day in Tsuta Ruins when we cut the pots, or when we destroyed the pots. Because otherwise we would have no way of setting it today since we never got sunrise. Hayabusa here is being a bit of a rascal.
Yeah, Hayabusa has a couple different attacks that make him invulnerable to our cherry bombs, and he wanted to show me all of them in this particular fight.
The other downside to this fight is that there's a bunch of patches of grass in the arena, and each time you blow one up it has a chance of dropping vegetables. And if you haven't eaten a certain type of vegetable before, it gives you a text box, so that loses a couple seconds, which is very annoying.
So we have a little bit of a long trek out of Kamiki Village here, back through Shinshu Field, which we haven't been here in a while. And we're going to want to leave as quickly as possible, get back to the action, and for us, the quickest way to do that is actually going to be unlocking another Mermaid Spring, which means we're going to have another Demon Gate fight, similar to what we did in Taka Pass. Fortunately for us, now that we do have Cherry Bomb, we're able to defeat these kinds of enemies much quicker than we were able to earlier in the game.
It is possible to do this a bit earlier, since we were in Shinshu Field before. However, it turns out that the movement works out to be about 10 seconds faster to do this fight much later. So now that we've either fed or fought all 8 canine warriors, our goal is to return to the village, to Kisa Village, so that we can gain the Satomi Power Orbs, which are the key to the next dungeon, which we actually skipped earlier when we did City Checkpoint Skip. So unfortunately, this is another one of those cases where we need the item that's in the dungeon, so we're going to be heading over there. Just a bit of a long walk. Lots of downtime here. This is basically the second real downtime point in the run where not too much is going on. We've been to all of these places already, so it's just a bunch of backtracking. One thing we didn't get to talk about much earlier is the dash restore mechanics. So normally when Ami's moving around, she has this base movement speed, which is, we just call that walking. When you do a tackle, which is this move that we do after every single loading zone, we gain green dash, which is the color of the trail that Ami leaves behind. And if we move in green dash for 5 seconds on the ground, we gain gold dash. And so some people call it wheat dash because it sort of looks like sprouts of wheat growing behind Ami. And this is another 30% faster than green dash. So overall, whenever we're jumping around into and out of cutscenes, our goal is to preserve that much faster movement speed, roughly 70% faster than base, which is very nice. So, go on.
One interesting area of investigation that we're looking into is the possibility of skipping, collecting these power orbs, and skipping the barrier at the beginning of Gale Shrine. This is something that's done in all of the New Game Plus categories of the run, but as of right now, the only way that we could avoid fighting the dogs, feeding the dogs, and collecting all of these orbs, the only way that's possible is to do about 10 frame-perfect jumps, which would allow us to basically teleport by dying before the game is able to update your position, and warping you deeper into this dungeon by kind of respawning before the game is able to set your respawn point. Unfortunately, the only way to do this in the new game category that we're aware of right now is to avoid touching the ground for more than 1 frame at a time, requiring 10 frame perfect inputs. So for now, the run is done slightly in line with the developer's intentions, at least in regards to entering this dungeon.
Yes, it is a cool trick, but unfortunately a bit too difficult for us at the moment. We will call it TAS only for now, even though some people have done it. So this brings us inside Gale Shrine. It's actually one of the simpler dungeons in the game. And it's yet another case where, spoilers, we're going to be skipping the latter half since we don't need to fight the boss. This first enemy here is called a Chimera. It's pretty basic, just 3 cherry bombs and it's down. But it does have a counter attack that we need to avoid. Pretty simple. One thing you'll notice, whenever we defeat an enemy with the cherry bomb, it actually sends its yen all over the arena since it explodes. So we have to run around to get it. So this gives us our key. So we had one of these in Tudor Ruins as well. This is a lockjaw key. One convenient thing about keys is that we can actually toss them and then they'll later respawn in our mouth, which is utterly pointless, but still kind of fun. Although Pop doesn't seem to do it here. Not a big deal. And that we bring this here over to this gate here, destroys the lockjaw, and that brings us to the elevator. And this is where we would be brought if we had done that skip that Pop was describing earlier. So this is an elevator powered by explosives, very fancy. And we need to use this one twice. So first we want to go up to the 2nd floor here and fight off yet another Chimera to get yet another key.
This is going to be kind of the last intermission segment of the run, you could say. This, as well as segments a little bit earlier with like doing Cat Call Tower, are definitely one of the more intentionally played segments of the game, with only a couple of ways to really speed them up. And then after this, we're going to be definitely going into crazy endgame once we're out of this place.
Yeah, so our objective here is pretty much solely to gain the power at the top of this dungeon, which happens to actually be the highest point canonically in the land of Nippon, Japan. And our objective is to gain a brush technique known as Gale Storm, which lets us make winds. And interestingly, the primary reason why we want Gale Storm is for an unfortunately hard required story check. There's just no way to skip this. No matter how many abilities we have, the only way around this would be wrong warping, if that were possible. So we will see why this is needed later. The only thing we have to do here is basically a short minigame where we draw some winds against these evil cursed winds that are causing the curse in Kusa Village.
So we're going to be doing the constellation here, collecting our prize for from the Gale Shrine, our Gale Storm technique. And then we're going to have, in a moment, a little bit of an interesting way to escape the Gill Shrine. So that whole segment of going up the elevator, running up these long series of steps, is a little bit slow, and we really don't want to have to do that all the way back in reverse. So fortunately for us, because we have the double jump technique that we're not intended to have, there is another way. So we're able to do a precise double jump and bonk to get over the invisible wall, preventing us from going out of bounds. And we're able to actually fall all the way down the Gill Shrine and land on the narrow section of bridge that's intended to be part of kind of one of the core puzzles of this area. You're intended to use Galestorm in order to rotate the bridge in order to access the latter part of the dungeon. Instead, it will serve as a landing platform for our out-of-bounds fall all the way down the windmill, and this will let us escape the Gale Shrine in only a matter of seconds instead of minutes by walking all the way back down.
Fun trivia there. So the boss of that dungeon of Gale Shrine is called Crimson Helm. He's a big cow-looking guy. So when you leave the dungeon early, the Isun tries to stop you and make sure that you're ready to leave. He says, do you really want to leave? And you say yes, and then he says, well, we can't ignore Crimson Helm forever. And that's a little bit ironic, since we literally just never fight the boss.
So now that we've kind of returned to kind of the first and second major dungeons of the game, and collected our powers and then promptly left, now we're kind of ready to return back to where we left off, more in the later game areas. The two dungeons that would have occurred after Tsuta Ruins and Gale Shrine would have been the Moon Cave and the Imperial Palace. However, those dungeons are in fact skipped in entirety, and the Brush Powers, Inferno, and Veil of Mist that you would have acquired there, as well as all our story triggers and other story progression is completely not required. So instead, we're going to be kind of progressing towards the fifth dungeon of the game and kind of doing the story triggers to set up to access that dungeon. And the first way to do that is we're going to be heading over back to North Ryoshima Coast and using our new Galestorm and Catwalk techniques in order to make our way to the Dragon Palace.
Yeah, so this area that we're going to next is called Watcher's Cape. It's just this little plateau inside North Rio. And at the top of that plateau, there's a dude called the Watcher. And we can grant his wish by drawing a dot on the sky to make a shooting star. Don't really ask us why this works, it just does. So then he's going to wish, since he's an amateur astronomer, that he could see the Whirlpool Galaxy. And this is very important because the Whirlpool Galaxy is actually part of the puzzle that the Dragonians created in order to hide their dragon palace at the bottom of the sea. So once we've made visible the Whirlpool Galaxy, that is not enough. We then have to create winds here on Earth in Japan, and for reasons that that no one can really understand. Spinning the winds on Earth causes the Whirlpool Galaxy to spin, as you can see there. And spinning the Whirlpool Galaxy causes a whirlpool, like a real whirlpool, to form in the Sea of Ryoshima. And then that is the portal to the Dragon Palace. Very logical. Very Shinto. If it wasn't already obvious, this entire game is very much so inspired by Shinto mythology. We are playing as Amaterasu for one, and almost all of the characters are based on Shinto myths and legends, even if in some kind of abstract ways.
Alright, and then we're going to be boarding back on Orca, who we summoned earlier in our first trip to northern Ryoshima, and use him to take us straight to the Dragon Palace. And here we're going to be addressing one of the storylines of the game is that in this northern Ryoshima coast, there's intended to be this whole exploration section where you're going through the ocean and visiting all these islands, and there's meant to be this dragon that's going crazy, the water dragon, that will eat you if you go out on the sea, and it's terrorizing all the residents of Nippon. So we're kind of addressing that storyline, despite the fact that we never really seen the water dragon at any point, actually, or heard of him before. You'll have to just trust us that it's a problem, and we're going to the Dragon Palace to work on that.
Yeah, if we had talked to Queen Himiko in Seion, she would have told us that the water dragon is preventing like imports into the city, which is part of what's causing all the people to die. But that the water dragon was actually supposed to be controlled by the Dragonians. So here we're meeting with Orohime, the queen of the Dragonians, and she's going to tell us, actually, the water dragon is literally my husband, and he's kind of crazy at the moment. I hope you'll forgive us. And she's going to give us permission to go inside the water dragon, who happens to be sleeping here in the Dragon Palace for some reason. And so we're just going to jump right inside. Yum yum.
Yeah, it's very reminiscent of like a Jabu Jabu type situation in which we have a dungeon in a fish creature, essentially, and quite the dungeon it is. It's a little bit of more of a mini dungeon, but it's one with jam-packed full of complicated movement and techniques we're going to be doing.
Yeah, so to start with, we're going to be avoiding these blue scrolls who will chase us.
Will they chase us this time?
They're very jealous. So we have to do some very crazy movement here. That's actually really close to hitting it.
Yeah.
I would have been scared there.
I was scared.
Okay, that gets us this key. And we need to do a water spout pillar. This is something we saw very briefly in the tutorial for water spout. There are some spots on the water where you can just draw a line straight up and it'll make a pillar. And so we just bring this key over to the lockjaw, and that will unveil the water orb, which is the secret to the water dragon's power. This is what lets Dragonians transform into the water dragon. So technically any of them can do it, or at least any of the royals. And so our objective is basically to take that water orb, which has now been fused with the water dragon, which I'm sure will have no ill effects whatsoever.
Yeah, so, if you try to interact with the orb, there's nothing you can really do with it quite yet, but as we go a little bit deeper, we find some noxious pools of liquid that will damage you if you swim in them or touch them, and we're able to use those to kind of open up some kind of sore on the ceiling of the water dragon, spurting even more noxious dangerous inner body fluids, I suppose, everywhere, inhibiting our path back.
This is some yummy stomach acid, as we like to call it. And so here we're going to be swimming through the stomach acid, so that this has two effects. So for one, we're swimming, so we're losing breath constantly, but it's also acid, so it's constantly draining our health. And it turns out we can't actually swim all the way through the acid because we would literally die. So instead, we're going to be using a fun camera trick here to let us start using the acid on the water orb a bit early. And then we're going to use a corner glitch jump there to keep ourselves outside of the acid for just long enough for this cutscene's trigger. And that lets us just barely survive without using any healing items. And this unveils the cause of the water dragon's ire, which is these monsters called the tube foxes. The tube foxes are sort of the incarnations of this magical artifact called the fox rods, which, if we'd done things normally up to this point, are actually something that another character has been searching for, Lady Rao. And so we get the fox rods here, we get the water orb, and now the water dragon's literally dying because we stole the source of its power and released all this stomach acid. So stomach acid is now raining from the ceiling. And this is actually kind of RNG. We're going to jump here. If the stomach acid hits us while we're in the air, we're going to fall into the water below. And that loses a lot of time because swimming is slow. But very luckily, we did not get RNG acided. And so we get to escape the water dragon quickly.
Yeah, one of the nice things about speedrunning in this game, there's not very many aspects of the game that are up to chance. It's a very good game for the runner in terms of you know, if you play the game well, you're gonna go fast. And this is one of those areas where that's just not always the case. Sometimes the acid just gets you, and you just have to deal with it.
Yeah, and like even if you get hit by the acid, the time loss is at most like 20 seconds. There's very little like big RNG in this run. It's very nice. So now that we have, so in that cutscene that we skipped, not only did Lady Rao come down under the ocean somehow to take the foxtrots from us, we now have to go inform Orihime that we just killed her husband. And so what this is going to initiate is sort of a chase sequence where it's revealed that Lady Rao, who we just gave this powerful magic artifact, is actually an imposter. And she's secretly an evil monster who's going to go kill Queen Himiko. So now we're being sent on a chase to go save Queen Himiko from the evil monster. A little bit of a flubby movement there, but no big deal.
Yeah, so all of this setup with the Dragon Palace and everything is basically we're just trying to get access to Oni Island. From like a speedrun routing perspective. There's a brush power in Oni Island that, unlike the brush powers in a few of the other dungeons, we're simply not able to skip. So as unconcerned as we are with Orihime and her husband, they are going to be our ticket to getting to that dungeon and kind of accessing the very end game areas that we haven't yet seen yet.
If you think about it, almost everything that we've done up till this point has in some way contributed towards reaching Oni Island, right? So getting Galestorm let us access the Dragon Palace. The Dragon Palace is hard required to access Oni Island due to this story sequence that we're going through here, with this very lovely music that we're hearing. Everyone loves this one. But like everything we had to do to get to Gale Shrine was itself required for that. And even everything we had to do to reach North Rio is obviously part of that. And then there's a bunch of other things that we're required to do within Oni Island that are in some way influenced by stuff we've done earlier. The only thing that could conceivably not have been done up till this point might be to the ruins, although technically that is still required due to needing to rescue the K9 warriors. So here we do some very glitchy movement up this hill there. To skip a few cutscenes that would take place with this person here. This is Rao's ghost. This is the real Rao, not the imposter. And she's going to lead us through this magic hole in the cliff, which is a secret tunnel. So this brings us right into the capital of Nippon, Seian. And conveniently, this actually skips the first part of Seian. The game is actually going to play a cutscene here because it thinks it's our first time in this area of Seian. And that cutscene looks kind of glitchy for various reasons.
Yeah, so we're approaching here one of the major tricks in the run. This is going to be a fire tablet skip. So functionally, the way that you're intended to access Queen Himiko is by completing the Imperial Palace dungeon and freeing a space traveler named Kaguya, who, as a reward for helping her with a digging minigame, will give you the fire tablet to let you swim through lava. However, as a result of skipping that dungeon, skipping that digging minigame and all of that, we can't touch fire without being damaged. And in fact, not just damaged, but it will instantly void us out. So we have to get across this pool of lava without touching it at all. And in order to do that, basically the setup works. You have to do a frame-perfect jump, and then some very precise jump and releasing jump inputs in order to make it across the lava. It's incredibly precise. There's only a couple variations of jumping and releasing jump that are even possible to work. We're able to use the brush inputs in order to kind of buffer releasing the jump button, but all the jump inputs are extremely tight frame windows and very, very challenging. And as a result of successfully executing that trick first try, we are able to get to where Queen Himiko would have been if we'd ever paid her a visit, and find that she's been murdered before we ever met her.
Yeah, so in her, like, I would say dying breath, but she's actually already dead. In her, like, spiritual dying breath, she reveals to us the secret location of Oni Island, which, I don't know why that we couldn't have just looked at it, since it's a big island, right? It's not that obvious, but, in any case, she then sends us to Oni Island, and this is when we finally can access it. So, just going back to Fire Tablet skip there, it's really hard to emphasize just how precise that trick is. For a very long time, we thought it wasn't even human viable, before I helped discover some setups that make it just a bit more lenient. But it's still incredibly precise, and the fact that Top was able to get it first try there is another applaudable moment.
And now, after much ado, and one more run through, well, really our first run through Sand City, we're now really ready to get to Oni Island soon. One interesting quirk about kind of the way that we have only traveled through Sand City backwards is there's a couple required cutscenes that are in our way, requiring us to jump off the bridge to avoid some mandatory story triggers, showing us about the pollution blighting Cyan that we will simply never address.
Yeah, so everyone here is just going to continue dying of this horrible plague until we defeat the fish in Hokkaido.
Really, the only person in Sand City who's gonna make out of it okay with this whole situation is probably the weapons dealer. He seems like he's doing fine, and I'm about to dump a boatload of yen on him for some exorcism slips. The shopping in this game, as you start to get toward the latter half of the game, you start to get immensely more yen than what we have for the first half of the run. And that's where the exorcism slips start to come into play. We used 3 of them to defeat the tube foxes very quickly, and most boss and enemy encounters for the rest of the run, we're going to be able to use exorcism slips in order to basically do damage in the entire fight area and very quickly defeat a lot of very powerful enemies.
Yeah, we haven't talked about battle items too much up till now. Exorcism slips are sort of basically, they just damage everything. It's a screen wipe, but it kills things even that aren't on screen. And there's 3 sizes, small, medium, large, doing increasing amounts of damage, and now that we have so much yen, we can sort of just spam them as much as we like, which simplifies combat greatly. There's still a few things where enemies aren't actually very vulnerable to exorcism slips, so to conserve yen, we use other techniques instead. Like you saw with the Evil Rao fight, we could have used exorcism slips there, but it turns out to be faster and easier and cheaper to just use Steel Fist Sake powered cherry bombs. And now, as we mentioned earlier, Orihime has used the water orb to transform into yet another water dragon. And this time, instead of rampaging in the seas, she's just going to become a bridge. And this is what lets us access Oni Island.
Alright, and for all the trouble it took us to get here, Oni Island is a pretty exciting dungeon. The first thing we're going to be doing here is called the forehead jump, in which we're going to be jumping off of Otohime's face in order to skip a required use of the Inferno and the Fire Tablet powers, in which you're intended to make kind of a lava spout that you can stand on. Unfortunately for us, we cannot control fire, nor can we stand on it. So we're going to be doing a very precise jump and double jump to skip that required use of that technique and that item. And we're then going to be doing yet another double jump and bounce to get out of bounds. There's an invisible wall that you can just barely slip over. And now we're going to begin traversing the external area of Oni Island, which is completely out of bounds and an oversight of the developers.
Yeah, so very fortunately, all of the collision on the exterior of this dungeon is physical, but it's all sloped, so we have to jump very quickly to avoid slipping down into the water below, which at that point we would just have to reset the trick and try again. But fortunately, Pop is very good at timing what we call green hops, where basically you jump the frame that you land, or not long after. There's a couple places you can get stuck on the collision, but it's not a big deal. And then, very fortunately, at the back side of the dungeon, there's another exterior portion with the brush technique that we want. So very conveniently, this basically lets us skip the entire first floor of the dungeon. Or almost all of it.
Unfortunately for us, as we're collecting this thunderstorm brush technique, we're not going to be able to so easily escape Oni Island as we left the previous 2 dungeons that we visited. Oni Island will be completed, and this will be actually the first boss we fight in the entire game. Will be here at the end of this dungeon. So even though we're kind of skipping the first half of the dungeon, the second half is going to be actually completed, and we're going to get some end game dungeon crawling a little bit here.
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite parts of the entire run, because a lot of the stuff you do here is cool, including at the start there. So now we're going into basically the second half of the first floor of Oni Island. Or like the first segment of it, the interior. After skipping all the exterior stuff and most of the interior.
So here we're going to see kind of the mechanic of this dungeon is instead of having lockjaw keys, we're going to be picking up these kind of lightning keys, which enable us to walk on these kind of special platforms here, marked with the lightning bolt. And furthermore, it also acts as a source of lightning for our brush ability to use. And to demonstrate that, I'm able to draw a line from the key to these kind of conductors, essentially, and use them to kind of electrically charge certain areas of the dungeon, and use that to kind of progress using that brush power.
Yeah, so the ability that we got earlier is called Thunderstorm. It's basically water spout for electricity. It is pretty powerful, but for the most part we're only going to be using it on a few required triggers. It is a hard requirement, and technically it's like, with glitches or cheats that we don't have access to, it is possible to escape Oni Island, but the game actually does hard check for you to have defeated the boss of this dungeon. So it actually ends up being preferred to defeat the boss anyway. So here we submit the key into this electric lock there, and we're going to use another use of Thunderstorm to blow up the statue, which is hiding some stairs. Very fancy.
One thing that's kind of interesting about how we blow up the statue is there's a very particular area where you can use your Thunderstorm ability in order to blow up the statue, but you don't trigger a cutscene in front of the statue that would kind of show you it and draw your attention to it. So there's a very kind of precise way to use to blow up that statue.
And then here you saw Pop is slashing these eye switches, which is just a little puzzle. And that brings us to the side-scroller area, or sometimes called the 2D segment, which is a fun little platforming segment where the game is just looking side-on. There's a few cycles in this area, so we're trying to move pretty quickly to meet them. There is technically a faster cycle that we can hit, but it's a bit more work, so we're just going to take it relatively easy. But it still looks pretty cool, the kind of movement you can do through this segment. So here we have to wait for this rotating bridge and then get under it.
There is a lot of like kind of micro movement tech you can do in this section. That spiked rotating platform, you're not really intended to jump on it. It damages you when you touch it. However, if you jump on it quickly enough, you can avoid taking damage and kind of use it as a boost, as well as some other kind of very precise jumps around other rotating platforms to kind of traverse them in a very elegant and efficient way.
And then coming up here we have these rotating platforms that you'll see. These, unfortunately we can't really beat this cycle, so we just have to wait a bit, and then we can start jumping up through them. And this is actually pretty precise in terms of timing to get all the way through efficiently.
And coming up here, this is going to be kind of the last section of the dungeon that we interact with. This is the 4th floor of Oni Island. There are a variety of tricks that you can use. There's uncountable techniques to kind of go through this area. The one we're going to be doing is called Toby Skip, where we quickly go around a fight trigger, and do a tackle jump off of this, electric key platform that we were able to walk on, a vine is going to be able to pull us out of bound if we do it in a very particular spot, and then we can use the same vine after cutting it. We can bounce out of bounds into the wall and have the vine pull us up onto the other side. So essentially, using this vine technique, we were able to get out of bounds and then also kind of get snapped back in bounds in a completely unintended area, completely skipping all sorts of different races, blockhead, and puzzles that were meant to be done on that floor.
Yes, and this brings us to the boss of the dungeon, Ninetales. Ninetales, if you've ever played Wind Waker, you might have heard of Jalhalla. Ninetales has the same sort of thing going on. We need to damage Ninetales a bit, then use Thunderstorm to electrocute it, and then that will cause it to split up into a bunch of different spirits, which we need to kill in 2 waves. And we're going to use Exorcism Subs to do that, which damages every spirit at once, and very conveniently lets us end these phases quickly and consistently.
Oh, you say that.
Yeah, sometimes things can go wrong. You hope for the best.
Yeah, so unfortunately for me here, I get a little bit unfortunate luck where the spirit very quickly picks up one of the split off forms of Ninetales, so we do get an extra cycle here that lost I think around like 35 or 40 seconds.
Yeah, sometimes things can go wrong. So you can see Ninetales has 2 tails left instead of 1. You have to go through an extra cycle. This is pretty rare. Actually quite unlucky to see this in a world record run. I would like to talk a bit more we did earlier, Toby skip. So there's a recurring character in this dungeon who we entirely skip every instance of, and that's Toby the Prayer Slip. So it's basically this character that races you through all these puzzles, but is supposed to be a security guard for Ninetales. So he totally flubs his job by basically letting himself get screwed. Because he has so much pride and wants to race us. So we consider Toby a true speedrunner. And at the end of the last race, he would basically destroy himself is it like a sort of honor thing. And very fortunately, we were able to save Toby by not racing him. So
hopefully there will be another challenger such that his life can at least have some meaning, but the fastest of all completely ignored him in some tragic irony.
Mm-hmm. A true speedrunner.
So we are now finally going to be going to a new area of the game. We entered northern Ryoshima Coast, where we are now, for the first time almost an hour ago, and since then have kind of been revisiting areas, and we're finally going somewhere new. So after defeating Ninetales and Oni Island, you are now invited to visit the frozen north, the land called Kamui, and we're going to be heading over there to kind of see the final areas of the game.
Yeah, so earlier I was talking about the fish in Hokkaido, and this is where we're finally getting onto that. But there is, an entire 3rd chapter of the game in our way, so we'll see how long that takes. This is actually one of the other required uses of Catwalk. Like we said earlier, it's very few required uses. Technically, they're all skippable, but some of those skips are not quite yet human viable to run, so we'll see how that develops. And then here we have what we affectionately call the Thunderdome, this big dome-shaped thing that contains a tunnel which leads to Kamui through the sea. And this is one of the things where we're required. This is basically the main thing that requires us to defeat Ninetales. Even if we could escape Oni Island, if it weren't for defeating Ninetales, there wouldn't be thunder here, so there would be no way of opening up the Thunderdome. This tunnel area here is actually in 2 parts, but both of them are technically maps within Kamui, so we can conserve our dash through them.
So as we're kind of entering Kamui for the first time, The running theme of this entire section of the game is everything is skipped. So the first order of business is that Kamui is cursed, much like how Ryoshima Coast and various other areas of the game are. So the first thing we need to do is bloom the Guardian Sapling. Unfortunately for us, blooming the Guardian Sapling would involve meeting a couple characters, watching some cutscenes, doing some combat, and finally using the Thunderstorm Brush technique to kind of explode a mountain that's covering up the Guardian Sapling. However, all of that sounds really boring and slow, and instead this is another opportunity to use a brush adventure, similarly to like the Northern Ryoshima brush adventure, where we were able to access that tree more quickly. We're doing the same thing here, where we're going to clip our brush out of bounds, and instead of exploding the mountain to expose the tree, we're able to bloom it from under the mountain, thus bringing us into the uncursed Kamui.
Right. So that's a very fancy trick. One of the longest brush adventures in the game. And then immediately after that, there's a required fight with an enemy called an igloo turtle, but we can skip that too. The trigger for it is absolutely massive. It stretches all across Kamui, but we can just barely clear it with the help of this vine flower here. And we had to do some sort of strange-looking movement to activate it. It's not fully understood why, but there are some very complicated mechanics associated with this particular flower and the conditions under which you can use it. So we just did the movement to fulfill all of those requirements, and that gets us around the igloo turtle trigger. And then here we're going to have our penultimate shopping trip. We're going to talk to this guy who has a fancy mask. We're going to buy 2 Infinity Stones, which we did get one of those earlier, but now we actually sold that one for money. Here we're intentionally buying some, and the reason we are doing that is because the Infinity Stone basically gives you unlimited ink for 1 minute. And that's very helpful in situations where we need to use a lot of brush techniques in quick succession, which hasn't really been necessary up till now, but will be soon.
Entertainingly, that shopper there is the only person we'll talk to in all of Kamui. As there's meant to be an entire village here that you're meant to save, and there's all sorts of exciting storylines going on here. And we're simply going to avoid those using this trick, which is the Webkier gate skip. So what we're able to do here is a very precise jump, double jump, and tackle to kind of reach an out-of-bounds slope. And by doing a green hop to get a jump quickly before we slide off the slope, we can jump further and further out of bounds, and in fact transition from one out-of-bounds section to another out-of-bounds section. And as a result of all of this, we are able to go around this big gate, which would require lots of cutscenes and dialogue in order for the villagers to let us through. Instead, by doing this very tricky out-of-bounds maneuver, we're able to completely ignore them, as we love to do in a speedrun, and completely access the sacred mountain Izofuji without their permission.
Yes, and so Izofuji is actually a pretty important area because this is the location of the evil fish. He's frozen in that lake there, and so unfortunately we need to unfreeze the lake. Basically, the reason why everyone in that village there is hiding is because there's a big blizzard, which is originating from this temple at the top of Izofuji. And normally, we couldn't actually get into that temple because it's locked behind this massive gate. But fortunately for us, we can get around that gate using some fancy movement. Now, if it weren't for that, this is actually one of the most massive sequence breaks in the entire game, because we'd have to go all the way back down Izofuji, back to Kamui, back through Webkier, and go through this entire section, which is basically like a full dungeon, more or less. Where we would go back in time 100 years, meet our previous incarnation called Shiranui, fight the true version of Orochi, who was defeated 100 years in the past, and then that would allow us to rescue a young girl who can sing a prayer to open this gate, but we can skip all that by just jumping on someone's house. Very fancy. And that brings us to the final dungeon, Waku Shrine.
Waku Shrine, it's a very exciting end to the dungeon aspect of the speedrun. There's a lot of very precise movement and brush techniques going to be used here. The very first one is going to be this Waku key skip. So the very first thing after you watch your camera pan introducing you to this very vertical, scary looking dungeon is there's a lockjaw right in our face, and the key takes a couple minutes to access. So on the other side of the key is going to be this big iceberg, and you're intended, of course, to unlock the gate before you melt the iceberg, but by doing this brush adventure, we're able to clip our camera to the other side and use the fireburst power to melt it early. And fortunately for us, that cutscene is one that will teleport Amaterasu when you do it, thus warping us to the other side of the gate. If we were to ever fall back on the other side, the original entrance of the dungeon, we can only do this this brush adventure one time. So this is a one-way ticket to get past the gate, and then once we're on that other side, we gotta keep going. There's no way back, basically, without having to get the key.
Yeah, so that was actually our first required use of Fireburst, and here's our second. So this might not look like something where fire would help, right? Because it's just these gears spinning really fast. But as it turns out, Fireburst has a second property in addition to creating fire. It also slows down the game, and not just because it causes lag, which it can do. But the game physically does a slowdown effect to sort of emphasize how strong Fireburst is, which conveniently is coded to basically work identically to another brush technique that we did skip, which is called Veil of Mist, which is explicitly a power to slow down time. And so there's a bunch of puzzles that are supposed to require Veil of Mist, but can be entirely replaced with Fireburst, which is very convenient because we got Fireburst anyway to replace Inferno. This is one of those cases. We have to melt this lever in order to get this next and final brush technique, which is Blizzard, which is basically just water spout for ice. And you can see we used the first Infinity Stone there because we ran out of ink due to Fireburst's unusually high ink consumption.
Yeah, so we're kind of blazing through this dungeon here, doing a couple skips and collecting the brush power very quickly, and then we're going to be doing a massive and quite difficult series of techniques in order to very quickly get to the end boss now. So the first thing we're going to be doing here is called Nechku Skip. So basically this dungeon is kind of intended to have a mini-boss halfway through in which you're meant to fight one of the two twin demons called Nechku. And the final boss of the dungeon, you're going to be fighting both of them together. However, we're able to skip this entire first mini-boss fight where you're fighting the first demon by doing this insane series of out-of-bounds jumps to get across that ledge like so, letting us reach an area intended to be basically the end of the dungeon extremely early. Actually, immediately after we get that Blizzard technique, we're able to do this and make our way towards that final boss fight.
So this brings us to the cannon room, which is actually a sort of hectic room. Basically, this room is intended to be done in a particular way where you use those cannons on the other side to blow up all of these red cannons. And then those cannons are constantly firing at you if you don't do it, which is very hard to avoid. But there's also the gold cannon, which you're required to defeat by reflecting its shots. And you can only reflect the shots if they've been slowed down with Fireburst or Veil of Mist. But Fireburst itself has a lockout period where you can't use brush techniques immediately after it. So we have to time our Fireburst very precisely, such that the slowdown effect lasts long enough that we can still power slash the shots, and that it's timed with the shots so that the shots don't blow up before we can power slash them. So overall, it's an incredibly difficult room to do efficiently, which is what Okami managed to do. And here you saw he did a bunch of parkour around this room, which we call the hot gear room, to avoid touching those flaming hot gears. And that just avoids a puzzle where we would have to bring out this ball of ice to freeze the gears with. And here's Oki, that you just saw. Oki's the elevator dog. He raises the elevator by barking. That's all he does. He has this entire storyline throughout the entirety of Kamui, where like he starts off being sort of a do-drag and is sort of an anti-hero, and then he learns his lesson, comes to our side and helps us. But this is literally the only time we see him in the entire game, and all he does is raise the elevator.
And with the defeat of the twin dragons, we've now beaten our second and final dungeon of the game. And from there, we have now raised up this this unholy arc, housing our main antagonist, this evil fish, I suppose. And first, much like Wind Waker, kind of around the same era, we're going to be having a boss rush of a variety of bosses, only one of which we've actually fought before.
Yeah, so unfortunately there's no way around this boss rush, but the fact that we haven't fought any of these bosses before means it's actually not very stale, and all of these bosses have their own cool, or most of them have their own cool things to them. It's still pretty fun. Now,
First, we're gonna need to spend our yen here. Something that's really nice about the end game of Okami Any % is the game gives you basically as much yen as you need. Every boss you beat gives you just enough yen to buy the items you're going to want in order to defeat the next few bosses. Kind of starting after Evil Rao and going towards the end of the game, we're constantly in this cycle of getting a bunch of yen from bosses and then buying exactly what we need to beat the next one.
Our first boss here is Blight. This is actually the cause of the horrific plague in Seon City. He's supposed to be fought with the technique we skipped, Veil of Mist, and this is actually the only time where Fire Burst doesn't replace Veil of Mist, it just doesn't work. But fortunately he has another attack that makes him vulnerable without Veil of Mist, and so we're going to be doing a precise attack combo to defeat him quickly here. Where we actually jump cancel our grounded combo and then do an air combo to get enough hits in to one-cycle him.
Then coming up here is the most difficult boss in this boss rush. It's going to be Orochi. In intended gameplay, this would be the third time that you fight Orochi, as you fight him once in the Moon Cave, once 100 years in the past, and then this third time you fight him in the Ark. Much more excitingly for us, we only have to fight him this one time, and it is a very cool fight. The main gimmick of Orochi, he's got these 8 heads you have to defeat, and it's a 2-phase fight. So initially what we're trying to do is we need to get 3 of his heads drunk using this purification sake, and there's a very specific manipulation that we're going to be doing with the heads in order to do this quickly.
Yeah, so this first phase is actually really tight in terms of the timing and movement required to do this effectively. Basically, there's a special property of the Earth Head's attack, this first head here, where it lets other heads activate, even though you're normally supposed to activate 1 of them at a time. So we're sort of stacking 3 of them together. And then we're going to try and get them all to roar at once by triggering them in a specific fashion. And this lets us use Water Spout with this sake in the ground to get 3 heads drunk at once. And then we need to repeat that, because we need to get 3 heads drunk twice in order to finish the phase. And all the while, we're avoiding a ton of hazards with all of their attacks going off. So it's very fancy, especially not getting hit here at all. And doing this multi-step Water Spout.
Yeah, so once you get 3 heads drunk, then we enter into Phase 2. And for Phase 2, essentially, each head has all of these kind of different special attacks that they have, and there's meant to be, this spectacle of using your brush powers to overcome their various attacks. However, if you position yourself in a certain way, you can actually manipulate all of the heads to do the same attack on you, and water spout them very quickly as you position yourself to bait the next head to attack. So the way that this ends up working out, there are 2 kind of cycles we do here, where we set up 4 heads to be drunk at the same time, and then defeat all of them, all 4 heads, by doing 2 exorcism slips while 4 of them are drunk. So we do 2 cycles of that, 4 at a time, and using just enough ink, we are able to defeat all 8 heads in a very elegant fashion by doing some very precise positional and brush effects to make it so that Orochi goes exactly the way we want.
Yeah, and all the while, there's these like missiles of fire falling from the ceiling, and if they hit you, it catches your tail on fire, which causes you to constantly take damage. So it's actually very easy to die during this fight. Fortunately, we do have an extra life, so it's not a run ender by any means, but it does lose a bunch of time. And furthermore, since we do these heads in 2 groups of 4, we actually have to do that pretty fast, because if we're too slow, the earlier heads that we get drunk will actually shake it off and not be vulnerable anymore. So all that manipulation is actually very important, not just for speed.
So here we've got the Spider Queen. This is the kind of halfway point of our boss rush, and it's the boss we would have fought in Suta Ruins if the game were capable of requiring us to fight her. It's a pretty straightforward boss as a repeat of the first boss in the game. There's not much to it. You simply have to use your vine technique in order to attach a couple of these flowers to hooks on her back, and use exorcism slips to defeat the vulnerable eyes that appear after creating this vulnerability.
So she goes down pretty quickly, just 2 exorcism slips want to make her vulnerable. And we're actually going to specifically position ourselves close to these warps. We haven't discussed it much until now, but each of these warps at the end of the fight appears in a static location, and except for Orochi, we can always position ourselves near it. We actually don't want to position ourselves inside the warp, because if you're inside the warp when it spawns, you have to leave the warp and then re-enter it for it to work, which is kind of annoying. So we do setups in order to ensure that we're close to the warp, but not too close.
So now we've got the return of Crimson Helm, who we ignored him pretty long, but now we've got kind of the reboot of him here in the arc. And unfortunately for Crimson Helm, he is very vulnerable to exorcism slips and is perhaps the quickest boss fight in the game, as he goes down in only like 5 or so seconds.
Yeah, so we start by doing an exorcism to break his armor, then use Galestorm to break his invulnerability, and then just unload on him until he's gone. Very fast. Didn't even get a chance to look at us. And all the while, we're getting these free perfect bonuses on the end of each fight, which gives us a lot of bonus EM. And that's what is going to let us get all of the items we need for the final boss, the evil fish.
And so we've only got one more boss left in the boss rush. This is the only one we've actually fought before. It's going to be Ninetales once again. And the fight will play out almost exactly the same as last time. Ninetales is actually very slightly easier in the boss rush. The actual Ninetales boss itself that you fight at the end has less HP and goes down a little bit quicker. However, the first phases of the fight, where you have to defeat the miniature versions of Ninetales, plays out about the same. Hopefully without as much as a disaster as there was the first time.
Yeah, interestingly, all of the arc bosses have their own quirks relative to their normal forms. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. For example, Spider Queen in the arc actually takes 1 extra vine compared to the Spider Queen you fight in Suda Ruins. But most of the other bosses have less health. One really nice thing is that Orochi, as you fight him in the Moon Cave, the first encounter, actually has a bunch of cutscenes associated with it, which sort of disrupt the flow of the fight and make it a lot more complicated to execute efficiently. But we don't have to worry about those cutscenes in the arc. Everything seems to be going quite smoothly with this version of Ninetales. And you'll see we also don't have to deal with the cutscene here either, unlike in Oni Island.
Yeah, this fight, it's there's fewer cutscenes, and it gives us an opportunity to collect all the yen that drops from defeating Ninetales' familiars, giving us a huge influx of yen right as we're preparing to fight the final boss. And that's going to come in handy, as, you know, bosses up to this point, we've been using, you know, 5, 7 exorcism slips or so at the most. However, the final boss, we're going to need a lot of exorcism slips, as it's meant to be a very long and epic fight. And unfortunately, we don't really want to do a long and epic fight, and we'll resist as much as we can, which means all that money we just got is going straight into exorcism slips to help us out.
Yeah, these characters that we're seeing all over the arc are actually like ghosts. They're the Celestials, who are the beings on the Celestial Plane, which is where Amaterasu is actually from. And for some reason, this guy has a store here. I don't know why he just doesn't give us stuff for free, since, you know, we're supposed to be allies, right? And he just dies here anyway, so there's no real need for money. He's already in the afterlife. It's very strange, but fortunately we have enough money to bribe him to give us all the weapons we need. And this brings us to the final boss, the evil fish. I did forget to mention something about the evil fish all the time that I was talking about earlier. Which is actually, it's an evil fish inside a giant mech, which is shaped like a ball. So, yeah, it's a bit more impressive than I might have first made it out to be, but this is Yami.
Yeah, so the first thing that happens with the Yami fight is he steals all of your brush powers. So kind of the canon of this fight is you start out as a normal wolf, kind of stripped of all of your godly powers and techniques. And you slowly have to kind of fight tooth and claw to get them all back. And the fight becomes more and more difficult as you're getting these brush powers back that you retrieve by damaging him. And you're able to kind of use these brush powers as you're retrieving them in order to kind of solve these new attacks that it's using to fight you. And as interesting as that sounds, it actually works out quite a bit better for us to simply use exorcism slips instead, especially at the very beginning when we have no brush powers at all.
Yeah, fortunately Yami wasn't smart enough to take away our items, only our godly powers. But the godly powers turn out to not be quite so good as some very explosive pieces of paper. But yeah, we're basically beating the brush techniques out of it. And one really interesting thing about this is, you know, we didn't get every brush technique. We skipped a bunch of them. But we still get them back during this fight. And we can actually use them. So the game gives us the actual legit versions of these brush techniques just for this fight, even though we never got them to begin with. Very nice of Yami.
And if you really think about it, I guess Yami's helping us, right?
Mm-hmm.
We couldn't get all the techniques ourselves, so he's going to give us a little boost here. So that was the second phase of the fight, and we're now moving on to phase 3. Phase 3 is the slot phase. So we're going to be just dumping a bunch of XLs into him right at the beginning, which kind of rigs the slots so that every time they spin, they're going to give us a brush technique back. In normal gameplay, you would be he'd be shooting out fire and ink and enemies and all sorts of frustrating barriers to reason with. But when you damage him so severely at the very beginning of the phase, it kind of just cuts to the chase and just gives you all your brush powers back.
And one interesting thing here is Yami during this phase is actually one of the few things that moves while you're using the brush. Most things are frozen, but Yami will still move, so we can actually pre-prepare our power slash and not have to time it quickly. Some of these attacks are actually a little bit difficult to avoid, but it's not a big deal. At this point, we just want to hit Yami as fast as possible. Since this is sort of a... we sometimes derisively call this fight the auto-scroller boss, since you know, a lot of it is waiting around for Yami to do the things that let us have more brush techniques. But it is, you know, a nice bit of downtime at the end of the run where, at this point, our time is sort of locked in, and all we have to do is mash our menus properly. It is a good opportunity, I'd say, to sort of thank a lot of the people who've contributed to making this run what it is today. When I first started running over a year ago, this run looked very different, and a lot of people have helped to make it as cool and fast as it is. Not least of which Pop Rocks, our runner today. But also people like Sinri, Skyryon, Cinderdog, Cornchunks, The Dang Cinderdang, Liriati, Kaiserato, Kinnan, Jester, Youngster Joey, Tinker Knight, MK Infinite, Raichu, Davey, Astral, Critical Sid, Sinakan, the Japanese runner, Giant Cookie Jar, Clyde, and Krino Teeter. And that brings us to the final phase.
And then here we're just going to be drawing our Broken Sunrise that we never really obtained, and then simply use 12 XLs in a row to defeat the final form of Yami, after skipping a heartbreaking cutscene in which Isun is able to gather all of Nippon to pray for us and give us our full power back, which we completely ignore in favor of just throwing paper at the boss until it dies.
Yeah, very much so like the ending of Earthbound. We have all these people praying for our well-being even though we never helped any of them. And that's it. That is Okami. New game any percent. Finally beaten in record time, 2 hours, 5 minutes, and 34 seconds. So, another thing that we never mentioned, this game is timed in-game time. We have a pretty accurate in-game timer. But it is not much different from the RTA. It's very, very nice. Yeah,
and it's a very exciting category. There's definitely a lot going on in a very active community that's even to this day implementing more and more new and difficult tricks, and one that's, I think, going to be really entertaining for people to see, as you know, the new game any percent category hasn't really been seen by people much at all, but especially not in this kind of new, increasingly difficult and powerful techniques we're starting to implement.
Yeah, it's just such a cool run now. So many fancy tricks and so much skips. When I first started, I wouldn't have called this game a particularly broken game, but you know how things go. The time can only ever get pushed down.
All right, and I think that's it. I hope you are able to seriously consider this run for the marathon, and would be happy to play it and bring the Wolf game back to GDQ.
Yes, thank you for watching. This has been Auride.
And I am Pop Rocks, and have a great day, and hopefully we'll get to see everybody soon.